Hello, my name's Nikki McGee and I am the Trust Lead for Religion and Philosophy at Inspiration Trust and also a Curriculum Lead at Heatherset Academy. Over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to show you how I sequence my curriculum to help students get the bigger picture, to fully understand a concept or a big idea, and to connect ideas together rather than having isolated chunks of knowledge. Here are the resources that you're going to be able to access after having watched this. And I hope that they are useful. Any feedback on them is always appreciated. There is loads of sort of additional reading or watching or listening. I won't go through them all because that will use up my 10 minutes. From the PowerPoint, I've given you links. So there are links to, for example, an article that I wrote for Homework Magazine about how I sequence teaching about Plato that might give you a little bit more detail that I'm going to do than I can do in this talk. There's also some RE specific resources such as Joe Kinnaird's blog, but also some general curriculum ideas as well. I do want to draw your attention to the RE Council website. I imagine most of you watching this are RE teachers, so I hope that you're aware of the Religion and Worldviews Toolkit. If you're not, I really do recommend that you have a look at it. And the final resources that I talk about in this presentation, some of those will be available to download in full from the RE Council website next academic year. So this is my Key Stage 3 curriculum, and we're going to focus on the philosophy units that start each year off. So in Year 7, we ask, what is the love of wisdom? In Year 8, we ask, does the concept of God make sense? Or is the concept of God coherent? And then in Year 9, we look at how do humans make moral decisions? So in Year 7, we do some epistemology. How do we learn? In Year 8, we do some religious philosophy. And in Year 9, we're doing some moral philosophy. And the big idea or the concept that I want my students to get is empiricism. And so we're going to see how in each of those units they look at empiricism in a slightly different way to build up quite a complex knowledge map, both of these philosophical areas, but also of what we mean by empiricism. So our Year 7 curriculum starts by looking at Heraclitus. And Heraclitus never used to be in our Year 7 curriculum, but repeatedly in our end of year summative assessments, we could see that our students just weren't really getting Plato. And so I see Heraclitus as a bit of a stepping stone that helps students understand Plato. And so I say to the students, this is Heraclitus. He's at the front of the School of Athens. Really great painting to use in philosophy lessons because all of the philosophers are stood in a way that says something about their approach to philosophy. We use this painting quite a lot across our philosophy units, and so it's something that is part of our storytelling and something that's very familiar. And we're going to find out that Heraclitus is grumpy because as a philosopher, he wants to achieve wisdom, but he's trying to understand a world that's constantly changing. And so it means that his knowledge is constantly out of date. And we do lots of activities to help the students understand this quote. So they think about it themselves, they talk about it in pairs. We do some cold calling, we do some group discussion, and then we lead into a piece of writing. So it's this idea, no man steps in the same river twice. It's not the same river, he's not the same man. We then introduce the words empirical knowledge and the idea of getting knowledge from your senses. To help them understand that, we will practice using our senses in class. So I might say, use your senses to tell me what colour are the walls. Use your senses to tell me about the temperature of the room. Use your senses to tell me what's happening downstairs in the drama studio. So this is our first example in Year 7 that's the opposite of empiricism. And then I think that they're ready to tackle the story of Plato's cave. And Plato is also going to offer the opposite of empiricism. So there's more to knowledge than just what you can get through your senses. You need to go escape your cave. To reinforce that idea of doubting knowledge from your senses, we now use visual illusions. You might want to stop the video to see if you can see the old woman or the young woman or both. They love these, and this unlocks for them the idea that we can't always trust our senses. Our senses can trick us. Then we return to the School of Athens, and now we introduce our first empirical philosopher. So this is Aristotle, and we talk about the disagreements because we're telling a story between Aristotle and Plato. We also look at the way that these two are standing in the School of Athens. We talk about why Plato is pointing up to the sky because knowledge is out there, whereas for Aquinas, knowledge is to be found in the world. We return to this image again in Year 9 when we look at Plato and Aristotle again before we do virtue ethics. So by the end of Year 7, they will understand what we mean by empiricism and using our senses. They will know that Aristotle believes in the value of empirical knowledge, that he's the first scientist, and they will also know that Heraclitus and Plato cast doubts on knowledge from your senses. And that then takes us to Year 8. Year 8 are going to ask, does the idea of God make sense? And where we're going with this unit is Aquinas' first cause argument, Paley design argument, but we're going to take baby steps to get there. I want them to link Aristotle, who we studied in Year 7, and his empiricism and his ideas of logic with Aquinas and William Paley. But I also want to acknowledge the influence of Jewish and Islamic philosophy on Aquinas. And so before I go to Aquinas, we remind the students of Aristotle. We talk about the fact that there was a period in Christian history when Plato is widely studied and Aristotle isn't. But in the Islamic and Jewish worlds, Aristotle is alive and kicking. He's being studied. And so we look at Ibn Rushd and Maimonides and their versions of the first cause argument. But we're also really interested in them gathering knowledge from the physical world, using empirical knowledge, valuing, studying the world, not retreating from it. And then having looked at previous versions of the first cause argument, we then go back and we look at Aristotle again. So I asked the students, this is a clip of one of my slides, that there's a philosopher from ancient Greece who's going to influence Thomas Aquinas. And as soon as I say empiricism, they know that it's Aristotle. And then we introduce Aquinas' first cause argument. By the time they've looked at Aquinas' first cause argument, they've studied it about 3 or 4 times, so their knowledge is really secure. And we've noticed this in both our formative and summative assessments, that the students get Aquinas much better, but they also get that sense of narrative and influence too. They weren't managing that before. Then we jump to William Paley, and again we trace that line of influence from Aristotle, Islamic Jewish philosophy, Aquinas, and then Paley. We set him in his historical context because his ideas don't come from nowhere, but what's of particular influence is his empiricism, his gathering knowledge from the physical world. He thinks you can look at the physical world and make logical arguments about the universe and God, which is what the design argument is. Then these might be some of the multi-choice questions that we would use both in the classroom but also on forms, on Teams, where we're testing that they've remembered what we've told them. We then introduce something new that's quite similar to empiricism. We'll look at natural theology. So not the same as empiricism, but similar. And so now we're broadening their understanding. So that's the end of year 8. So at the end of year 8, they've revisited Aristotle. They've looked at Aristotle's influence on Jewish and Islamic philosophy. They've then looked at Aquinas' first cause, and they've looked at Paley's design argument, and all of those thinkers are using empirical knowledge. Then at the start of year 9, we switch to moral philosophy, and we ask the question, what is a good life? And we start with Aristotle, so jumping back to year 7, and virtue ethics. We do a recap of Plato and Aristotle before we go any further. And we have a formative assessment to check that they get Plato and Aristotle, and we don't move forward until we're happy that they have got that. And we read an extract from A Little History of Philosophy, and I love that this chapter mirrors my sequencing. So Warburton takes us back to Plato, talks about Plato as an armchair philosopher sat in his chair thinking. That's very different from Aristotle, who wants to go out into the physical world and study it. And Aristotle wants humans to have the best experience of the physical world that he is studying. And so we're using empiricism to help the students understand virtue ethics. And I think that they have a much richer understanding of virtue ethics than they did in previous years, where we almost went straight in and started looking at tables of virtues and vices. I like that they have that richer understanding of the world is great, it's fascinating, live your best life in it, flourish, experience eudaimonia. And then we jump way forward in time to utilitarianism and Jeremy Bentham. And just as we introduced natural theology when we looked at Aquinas and Paley, we're now going to introduce the scientific method with Jeremy Bentham. And again, we're going to use lots of multi-choice whiteboard questions, as well as short and longer pieces of writing to check that they understand this. And I think linking the scientific method, empiricism and utilitarianism helps the students see how this is different from religious ethics, because we look at where they get their information from. So a utilitarian knows what is right or wrong, not by going to an ancient text or the Bible, but by observing society, looking at the actions that create good consequences. Again, I think this leads to a much richer understanding of utilitarianism than just jumping straight in and talking about happiness and hedonism, etc. And our year 9 assessments definitely better after taking this approach. So I hope that I've shown you how using different styles of philosophy, epistemology, moral philosophy, religious philosophy, we're helping our students to view empiricism under slightly different lenses. We've also used a huge range of philosophers from different religious and non-religious worldviews, but also from different historical contexts, and also a huge range of activities to check that they know what I need them to know before I move on to the next thing. And I hope that at the end of this, they have a much richer understanding, both of the philosophical ideas, but also of the term empiricism. So my questions for you are, what are the golden threads in your curriculum? But also, how are you helping students understand the idea of influence, whether that's historical influence or the influence of previous thinkers, rather than presenting ideas appearing in a vacuum? I look forward to reading your responses. Thank you very much.